Summary for Policymakers of the IPBES Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Authors Sandra Diaz, Joseph Setele, Eduardo Brondizio, Hien Ngo, Maximilian Gers, John Agard, Almut Arneth, Patricia Balvanera, Kate Brownman, Stuart Butchart, Kai Chan, Lucas Garibaldi, Kazuhito Ichii, Jiangu Liu, Sunitha Mazancheri Subramanian, Guy Midgley, Patricia Miloslavich, Zsolt Molnar, David Abura, Alexander Pfaff, Stephen Pulaski, Andy Purvis, Jonah Razak, Belinda Reyes, Rinku Roy Chowdhury, Yunjai Shin, Ingrid Visserin Haumakers, Catherine Willis, and Cynthia Zayas. Key Messages. Section A. Nature and its vital contributions to people, which together embody biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services, are deteriorating worldwide. Nature embodies different concepts for different people, including biodiversity, ecosystems, Mother Earth, systems of life, and other analogous concepts. Nature's contributions to people embody different concepts, such as ecosystem goods and services and nature's gifts. Both nature and nature's contributions to people are vital for human existence and good quality of life, human well-being, living in harmony with nature, living well in balance and harmony with Mother Earth, and other analogous concepts. While more food, energy and materials than ever before are now being supplied to people in most places, this is increasingly at the expense of nature's ability to provide such contributions in the future, and frequently undermines nature's many other contributions, which range from water quality regulation to sense of place. The biosphere, upon which humanity as a whole depends, is being altered to an unparalleled degree across all spatial scales. Biodiversity, the diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems, is declining faster than at any time in human history. Key message A1. Nature is essential for human existence and good quality of life. Most of nature's contributions to people are not fully replaceable, and some are irreplaceable. Nature plays a critical role in providing food and feed, energy, medicines and genetic resources, and a variety of materials fundamental for people's physical well-being and for maintaining culture. For example, more than 2 billion people rely on wood fuel to meet their primary energy needs. An estimated 4 billion people rely primarily on natural medicines for their health care, and some 70% of drugs used for cancer are natural or are synthetic products inspired by nature. Nature, through its ecological and evolutionary processes, sustains the quality of the air, fresh water, and soils on which humanity depends, distributes fresh water, regulates the climate, provides pollination and pest control, and reduces the impact of natural hazards. For example, more than 75% of global food crop types, including fruits and vegetables, and some of the most important cash crops such as coffee, cocoa and almonds, rely on animal pollination. Marine and terrestrial ecosystems are the sole sinks for anthropogenic carbon emissions, with a gross sequestration of 5.6 gigatons of carbon per year, the equivalent of some 60% of global anthropogenic emissions. Nature underpins all dimensions of human health and contributes to non-material aspects of quality of life. Inspiration and learning, physical and psychological experiences, and supporting identities that are central to quality of life and cultural integrity, even if their aggregated value is difficult to quantify. Most of nature's contributions are co-produced with people, but while anthropogenic assets, knowledge and institutions, technology, infrastructure and financial capital, can enhance or partially replace some of these contributions, some are irreplaceable. The diversity of nature maintains humanity's ability to choose alternatives in the face of an uncertain future. Key message A2. Nature's contributions to people are often distributed unequally across space and time and among different segments of society. There are often trade-offs in the production and use of nature's contributions. Benefits and burdens associated with co-production and use of nature's contributions are distributed and experienced differently among social groups, countries and regions. Giving priority to one of nature's contributions to people, such as food production, can result in ecological changes that reduce other contributions. Some of these changes may benefit some people at the expense of others, particularly the most vulnerable, as may changes in technological and institutional arrangements. For example, although food production today is sufficient to satisfy global needs, approximately 11% of the world's populations is undernourished, and diet-related disease drives 20% of premature mortality, related both to undernourishment and to obesity. The great expansion in the production of food, feed, fibre and bioenergy has occurred at the cost of many other contributions of nature to quality of life, including regulation of air and water quality, climate regulation and habitat provision. Synergies also exist, such as sustainable agricultural practices that enhance soil quality, thereby improving productivity and other ecosystem functions and services, such as carbon sequestration and water quality regulation. Key message A3. Since 1970, trends in agricultural production, fish harvest, bioenergy production and harvest of materials have increased, but 14 of the 18 categories of contributions of nature that were assessed, mostly regulating and non-material contributions, have declined. The value of agricultural crop production, $2.6 trillion in 2016, has increased approximately threefold since 1970, and raw timber harvest has increased by 45%, reaching some 4 billion cubic metres in 2017, with the forestry industry providing about 13.2 million jobs. However, indicators of regulating contributions, such as soil organic carbon and pollinator diversity, have declined, indicating that gains in material contributions are often not sustainable. Currently, land degradation has reduced productivity in 23% of the global terrestrial area, and between $235 billion and $577 billion in annual global crop output is at risk as a result of pollinator loss. Moreover, loss of coastal habitats and coral reefs reduces coastal protection, which increases the risk from floods and hurricanes to life and property for the 100 million to 300 million people living within coastal 100-year flood zones. Key message A4. Nature across most of the globe has now been significantly altered by multiple human drivers, with the great majority of indicators of ecosystems and biodiversity showing rapid decline. 75% of the land surface is significantly altered, 66% of the ocean area is experiencing increasing cumulative impacts, and over 85% of wetlands by area has been lost. While the rate of forest loss has slowed globally since 2000, this is distributed unequally. Across much of the highly biodiverse tropics, 32 million hectares of primary or recovering forest were lost between 2010 and 2015. The extent of tropical and subtropical forests is increasing within some countries, and the global extent of temperate and boreal forests is increasing. A range of actions, from restoration of natural forest to planting of monocultures, contribute to these increases but have very different consequences for biodiversity and its contributions to people. Approximately half the live coral cover on coral reefs has been lost since the 1870s, with accelerating losses in recent decades due to climate change exacerbating other drivers. The average abundance of native species in most major terrestrial biomes has fallen by at least 20%, potentially affecting ecosystem processes and hence nature's contributions to people. This decline has mostly taken place since 1900 and may be accelerating. In areas of high endemism, native biodiversity has often been severely impacted by invasive alien species. Population sizes of wild vertebrate species have tended to decline over the last 50 years on land, in fresh water, and in the sea. Global trends in insect populations are not known, but rapid declines have been well documented in some places. Key message A5. Human actions threaten more species with global extinction now than ever before. An average of about 25% of species in assessed animal and plant groups are threatened, suggesting that around 1 million species already face extinction, many within decades, unless action is taken to reduce the intensity of drivers of biodiversity loss. Without such action, there will be a further acceleration in the global rate of species extinction, which is already at least tens to hundreds of times higher than it has averaged over the past 10 million years. Key message A6. Globally, local varieties and breeds of domesticated plants and animals are disappearing. This loss of diversity, including genetic diversity, poses a serious risk to global food security by undermining the resilience of many agricultural systems to threats such as pests, pathogens, and climate change. Fewer and fewer varieties and breeds of plants and animals are being cultivated, raised, traded, and maintained around the world, despite many local efforts which include those by indigenous peoples and local communities. By 2016, 559 of the 6,190 domesticated breeds of mammals used for food and agriculture, over 9%, had become extinct, and at least 1,000 more are threatened. In addition, many crop wild relatives that are important for long-term food security lack effective protection, and the conservation status of wild relatives of domesticated mammals and birds is worsening. Reductions in the diversity of cultivated crops, crop wild relatives, and domesticated breeds mean that agroecosystems are less resilient against future climate change, pests, and pathogens. Key message A7. Biological communities are becoming more similar to each other in both managed and unmanaged systems within and across regions. This human-caused process leads to losses of local biodiversity, including endemic species, ecosystem functions, and nature's contributions to people. Key message A8. Human-induced changes are creating conditions for fast biological evolution, so rapid that its effects can be seen in only a few years or even more quickly. The consequences can be positive or negative for biodiversity and ecosystems, but can create uncertainty about the sustainability of species, ecosystem functions, and the delivery of nature's contributions to people. Understanding and monitoring these biological evolutionary changes are as important for informed policy decisions as in the cases of ecological change. Sustainable management strategies then can be designed to influence evolutionary trajectories so as to protect vulnerable species and reduce the impact of unwanted species such as weeds, pests, or pathogens. The widespread declines in geographic distribution and population sizes of many species make clear that, although evolutionary adaptation to human-caused drivers can be rapid, it has often not been sufficient to mitigate them fully. Section B. Direct and indirect drivers of change have accelerated during the past 50 years. The rate of global change in nature during the past 50 years is unprecedented in human history. The direct drivers in change with the largest global impact have been, starting with those with the most impact, changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation of organisms, climate change, pollution, and invasion of alien species. Those 5 direct drivers result from an array of underlying causes, the indirect drivers of change, which are in turn underpinned by societal values and behaviours that include production and consumption patterns, human population dynamics and trends, trade, technological innovations, and local through global governance. The rate of change in the direct and indirect drivers differs among regions and countries. Key message B1. For terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, land use change has had the largest relative negative impact on nature since 1970, followed by direct exploitation, in particular overexploitation, of animals, plants and other organisms, mainly via harvesting, logging, hunting and fishing. In marine ecosystems, direct exploitation of organisms, mainly fishing, has had the largest relative impact, followed by land and sea use change. Agricultural expansion is the most widespread form of land use change, with over 1/3 of the terrestrial land surface being used for cropping or animal husbandry. This expansion, alongside a doubling of urban area since 1992 and an unprecedented expansion of infrastructure linked to growing population and consumption, has come mostly at the expense of forests, largely old-growth tropical forests, wetlands and grasslands. In freshwater ecosystems, a series of combined threats that include land use change, including water extraction, exploitation, pollution, climate change, and invasive species, are prevalent. Human activities have had a large and widespread impact on the world's oceans. These include direct exploitation, in particular overexploitation, of fish, shellfish, and other organisms, land and sea-based pollution, including from river networks, and land and sea use change, including coastal development for infrastructure and aquaculture. Key message B2. Climate change is a direct driver that is increasingly exacerbating the impact of other drivers on nature and human well-being. Humans are estimated to have caused an observed warming of approximately 1.0 degrees Celsius by 2017 relative to pre-industrial levels, with average temperatures over the past 30 years rising by 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade. The frequency and intensity of extreme weather events and the fires, floods, and droughts that they can bring have increased in the past 50 years, while the global average sea level has risen by 16 to 21 centimetres since 1900, and a rate of more than 3 millimetres per year over the past 2 decades. These changes have contributed to widespread impacts in many aspects of biodiversity, including species distributions, phenology, population dynamics, community structure, and ecosystem function. According to observational evidence, the effects are accelerating in marine, terrestrial, and freshwater ecosystems and are already impacting agriculture, aquaculture, fisheries, and nature's contributions to people. Compounding effects of drivers such as climate change, land and sea use change, overexploitation of resources, pollution, and invasive alien species are likely to exacerbate negative impacts on nature, as has been seen in different ecosystems such as coral reefs, the Arctic systems, and savannas. Key message B3. Many types of pollution, as well as invasive alien species, are increasing with negative impacts for nature. Although global trends are mixed, air, water and soil pollution have continued to increase in some areas. Marine plastic pollution in particular has increased tenfold since 1980, affecting at least 267 species, including 86% of marine turtles, 44% of seabirds and 43% of marine mammals. This can affect humans through food chains. Greenhouse gas emissions, untreated urban and rural waste, pollutants from industrial mining and agricultural activities, oil spills and toxic dumping have had strong negative effects on soil, freshwater and marine water quality and the global atmosphere. Cumulative records of alien species have increased by 40% since 1980, associated with increased trade and human population dynamics and trends. Nearly 1/5 of the Earth's surface is at risk from plant and animal invasions, impacting native species, ecosystem functions, and nature's contributions to people as well as economies and human health. The rate of introduction of new invasive alien species seems higher than ever before and with no signs of slowing. Key message B4. In the past 50 years, the human population has doubled. The global economy has grown nearly fourfold and global trade has grown tenfold, together driving up the demands for energy and materials. A variety of economic, political and social factors, including global trade and the spatial decoupling of production from consumption, have shifted the economic and environmental gains and losses of production and consumption, contributing to new economic opportunities, but also impacts on nature and its contributions to people. Levels of consumption of material goods, food, feed, timber and fibre, vary greatly, and unequal access to material goods can be associated with inequity and may lead to social conflict. Economic exchange contributes to aggregate economic development, yet often is negotiated between actors and institutions of unequal power, which influences the distribution of benefits and long-term impacts. Countries at different levels of development have experienced different levels of deterioration of nature for any given gain in economic growth. Exclusion, scarcities and/or unequal distributions of nature's contributions to people may, and in a complex interaction with other factors, fuel social instability and conflict. Armed conflicts have an impact on ecosystems beyond destabilizing effects on societies and a range of indirect impacts, including displacement of people and activities. Key message B5. Economic incentives generally have favoured expanding economic activity and often environmental harm over conservation or restoration. Incorporating the consideration of the multiple values of ecosystem functions and of nature's contribution to people into economic incentives has, in the economy, been shown to permit better ecological, economic and social outcomes. Local, national, regional and global governance have improved outcomes in this way by supporting policies, innovation and the elimination of environmentally harmful subsidies, introducing incentives in line with the value of nature's contributions to people, increasing sustainable land and sea use management and enforcing regulations, among other measures. Harmful economic incentives and policies associated with unsustainable practices of fisheries, aquaculture, agriculture including fertilizer and pesticide use, livestock, forestry, mining and energy including fossil fuels and biofuels are often associated with land and sea use change and overexploitation of natural resources as well as inefficient production and waste management. Vested interests may oppose the removal of subsidies or the introduction of other policies. Yet, policy reforms to deal with such causes of environmental harm offer the potential to both conserve nature and provide economic benefits, including when policies are based on more and better understanding of the multiple values of nature's contributions. Key message B6. Nature managed by indigenous peoples and local communities is under increasing pressure. Nature is generally declining less rapidly in indigenous peoples' land than in other lands, but is nevertheless declining, as is the knowledge of how to manage it. At least a quarter of the global land area is traditionally owned, managed, used or occupied by indigenous peoples. These areas include approximately 35% of the area that is formally protected and approximately 35% of all remaining terrestrial areas with very low human intervention. In addition, a diverse array of local communities including farmers, fishers, herders, hunters, ranchers and forest users manage significant areas under various property and access regimes. Among the local indicators developed and used by Indigenous peoples and local communities, 72% show negative trends in nature that underpin local livelihoods and well-being. The areas managed under various types of tenure and access regimes by Indigenous peoples and local communities are facing growing resource extraction, commodity production, mining and transport and energy infrastructure. The areas managed under various types of tenure and access regimes by Indigenous peoples and local communities are facing growing resource extraction, commodity production, mining and transport and energy infrastructure, with various consequences for local livelihoods and health. Some climate change mitigation programs have had negative impacts on Indigenous peoples and local communities. The negative impacts of all these pressures include continued loss of subsistence and traditional livelihoods from ongoing deforestation, loss of wetlands, mining, the spread of unsustainable agriculture, forestry and fishing practices, and impacts on health and well-being from pollution and water insecurity. These impacts also challenge traditional management, the transmission of Indigenous and local knowledge, the potential for sharing of benefits arising from the use of, and the ability of Indigenous peoples and local communities to conserve and sustainably manage wild and domesticated biodiversity that are also relevant to the broader society. Section C. Goals for conserving and sustainably using nature and achieving sustainability cannot be met by current trajectories, and goals for 2030 and beyond may only be achieved through transformative changes across economic, social, political, and technological factors. Past and ongoing rapid declines in biodiversity, ecosystem functions, and many of nature's contributions to people mean that most international societal and environmental goals, such as those embodied in the Aichi Biodiversity Targets and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, will not be achieved based on current trajectories. These declines will also undermine other goals, such as those specified in the Paris Agreement adopted under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the 2050 Vision for Biodiversity. The negative trends in biodiversity and ecosystem functions are projected to continue or worsen in many future scenarios in response to indirect drivers such as rapid human population growth, unsustainable production and consumption, and associated technological development. In contrast, scenarios and pathways that explore the effects of a low to moderate population growth and transformative changes in production and consumption of energy, food, feed, fibre and water, sustainable use, equitable sharing of the benefits arising from use, and nature-friendly climate adaptation and mitigation will better support the achievement of future societal and environmental objectives. Key message C1. Implementation of policy responses and actions to conserve nature and manage it more sustainably has progressed, yielding positive outcomes relative to scenarios of no intervention, but not sufficiently to stem the direct and indirect drivers of nature deterioration. It is therefore likely that most of the Aichi biodiversity targets for 2020 will be missed. Some of the Aichi biodiversity targets will be partially achieved. For example, those related to policy responses such as the spatial extent of terrestrial and marine protected areas, identification and prioritization of invasive alien species, national biodiversity strategies and action plans such as the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization, to the Convention on Biological Diversity. However, while protected areas now cover 15% of terrestrial and freshwater environments and 7% of the marine realm, they only partly cover important sites for biodiversity and are not yet fully ecologically representative and effectively or equitably managed. there has been significant growth in official development assistance in support of the Convention on Biological Diversity and funding provided by the Global Environment Facility, with biodiversity aid flows reaching $8.7 billion annually. However, current resource mobilisation from all sources is not sufficient to achieve the Aichi biodiversity targets. In addition, only 1 in 5 of the strategic objectives and goals across 6 global agreements relating to nature and the protection of the global environment are demonstrably on track to be met. For nearly 1/3 of the goals of these conventions, there has been little or no progress towards them, or instead, movement away from them. Key message C2. Nature is essential for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. However, taking into consideration that the Sustainable Development Goals are integrated and indivisible as well as implemented nationally, current negative trends in biodiversity and ecosystems will undermine progress towards 80%, 35 out of 44 of the assessed targets of goals related to poverty, hunger, health, water, cities, climate, oceans and lands. Sustainable Development Goals 1, 2, 3, 6, 11, 13, 14 and 15. Important positive synergies between nature and goals on education, gender equality, reducing inequalities and promoting peace and justice, Sustainable Development Goals 4, 5, 10 and 16, were found. Land or resource tenure insecurity, as well as declines in nature, have greater impacts on women and girls, who are most often negatively impacted. However, current focus and wording of targets in these goals obscures or omits their relationship to nature, thereby preventing their assessment here. There is a critical need for future policy targets, indicators and datasets to more explicitly account for aspects of nature and their relevance to human well-being in order to more effectively track the consequences of trends in nature on Sustainable Development Goals. Some pathways chosen to achieve the goals related to energy, economic growth, industry and infrastructure, and sustainable consumption and production, Sustainable Development Goals 7, 8, 9 and 12, as well as targets related to poverty, food security and cities, Sustainable Development Goals 1, 2 and 11, could have substantial positive or negative impacts on nature, and therefore on the achievement of other Sustainable Development Goals. Areas of the world projected to experience significant negative impacts from global changes in climate, biodiversity, ecosystem functions, and nature's contributions to people are also home to large concentrations of indigenous peoples and many of the world's poorest communities. Because of their strong dependency on nature and its contributions for subsistence, livelihoods and health, these communities will be disproportionately hard hit by those negative changes. Those negative effects also influence the ability of indigenous peoples and local communities to manage and conserve wild and domesticated biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. Indigenous peoples and local communities have been proactively confronting such challenges in partnership with each other and with an array of other stakeholders through co-management systems and local and regional monitoring networks, and by revitalising and adapting local management systems. Regional and global scenarios lack an explicit consideration of the views, perspectives and rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, their knowledge and understanding of large regions and ecosystems, and their desired future development pathways. Key message C4. Except in scenarios that include transformative change, negative trends in nature, ecosystem functions, and in many of nature's contributions to people are projected to continue to 2050 and beyond, due to the projected impacts of increasing land and sea use change, exploitation of organisms, and climate change. Negative impacts arising from pollution and invasive alien species will likely exacerbate these trends. There are large regional differences in the projected patterns of future biodiversity and ecosystem functions and loss and changes in nature's contributions to people. These differences arise from direct and indirect drivers of change, which are projected to impact regions in different ways. While regions worldwide face further declines in biodiversity in future projections, tropical regions face particular combined risks of declines due to interactions of climate change, land use change, and fisheries exploitation. Marine and terrestrial biodiversity in boreal, subpolar and polar regions is projected to decline mostly because of warming, sea ice retreat, and enhanced ocean acidification. The magnitude of impacts and the differences between regions are much greater in scenarios with rapid increases in consumption or human population than in scenarios based on sustainability. Acting immediately and simultaneously on multiple indirect and direct drivers has the potential to slow, halt, and even reverse some aspects of biodiversity and ecosystem loss. Key message C5. Climate change is projected to become increasingly important as a direct driver of changes in nature and its contributions to people in the next decades. Scenarios show that meeting the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2050 vision for biodiversity depends on taking into account climate change impacts in the definition of future goals and objectives. The future impacts of climate change are projected to become more pronounced in the next decades, with variable relative effects depending on scenario and geographic region. Scenarios project mostly adverse climate change effects on biodiversity and ecosystem function, which worsen, in many cases exponentially, with incremental global warming. Even for global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius, the majority of terrestrial species ranges are projected to shrink profoundly. Changes in ranges can adversely affect the capacity of terrestrial protected areas to conserve species, greatly increase local species turnover, and substantially increase the risk of global extinctions. For example, a synthesis of many studies estimates that the fraction of species at risk of climate-related extinction is 5% at 2 degrees Celsius warming, rising to 16% at 4.3 degrees Celsius warming. Coral reefs are particularly vulnerable to climate change and are projected to decline to 10 to 30% of former cover at 1.5 degrees Celsius warming and to less than 1% at 2 degrees Celsius warming. Therefore, scenarios show that limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius plays a critical role in reducing adverse impacts on nature and its contributions to people. Section D. Nature can be conserved, restored, and used sustainably while simultaneously meeting other global societal goals through urgent and concerted efforts fostering transformative change. Societal goals, including those for food, water, energy, health, and the achievement of human well-being for all, mitigating and adapting to climate change, and conserving and sustainably using nature, can be achieved in sustainable pathways through the rapid and improved deployment of existing policy instruments and new initiatives that more effectively enlist individual and collective action for transformative change. Since current structures often inhibit sustainable development and actually represent the indirect drivers of biodiversity loss, such fundamental structural change is called for. By its very nature, transformative change can expect opposition from those with interests vested in the status quo, but such opposition can be overcome for the broader public good. If obstacles are overcome, commitment to mutually supportive international goals and targets, supporting actions by Indigenous peoples and local communities at the local level, new frameworks for private sector investment and innovation, inclusive and adaptive governance approaches and arrangements, multi-sectoral planning and strategic policy mixes can help to transform the public and private sectors to achieve sustainability at the local, national, and global levels. Key message D1. The global environment can be safeguarded through enhanced international cooperation and linked locally relevant measures. The review and renewal of agreed environment-related international goals and targets based on the best available scientific knowledge and the widespread adoption and funding of conservation, ecological restoration and sustainable use actions by all actors, including individuals, are key to this safeguarding. Such widespread adoption implies advancing and aligning local, national and international sustainability efforts and mainstreaming biodiversity and sustainability across all extractive and productive sectors, including mining, fisheries, forestry and agriculture, so that individual and collective actions together result in the reversal of deterioration of ecosystem services at the global level. Yet these bold changes to the direct drivers of nature deterioration cannot be achieved without transformative change that simultaneously addresses the indirect drivers. Key message D2. 5 main interventions, or levers, can generate transformative change by tackling the underlying indirect drivers of nature deterioration. 1. Incentives and capacity building. 2. Cross-sectoral cooperation. 3. Preemptive action. 4. Decision-making in the context of resilience and uncertainty. And 5. Environmental law and implementation. Employing these levers involves the following in turn. 1. Developing incentives and widespread capacity for environmental responsibility and eliminating perverse incentives. 2. Reforming sectoral and segmented decision-making to promote integration across sectors and jurisdictions. 3. Taking preemptive and precautionary actions in regulatory and management institutions and businesses to avoid, mitigate and remedy the deterioration of nature and monitoring their outcomes. 4. Managing for resilient social and ecological systems in the face of uncertainty and complexity to deliver decisions that are robust in a wide range of scenarios. And 5. Strengthening environmental laws and policies in their implementation and the rule of law more generally. All 5 levers may require new resources, particularly in low-capacity contexts, such as in many developing countries. Key message D3. Transformations towards sustainability are more likely when efforts are directed at the following key leverage points where efforts yield exceptionally large effects. 1. Visions of a good life. 2. Total consumption and waste. 3. Values and actions. 4. Inequalities. 5. Justice and inclusion in conservation. 6. Externalities and telecouplings. 7. Technology, innovation and investment. And 8. Education and knowledge generation and sharing. Specifically, the following changes are mutually reinforcing. 1. Enabling visions of a good quality of life that do not entail ever-increasing material consumption. 2. Lowering total consumption and waste, including by addressing both population growth and per capita consumption differently in different contexts. 3. Unleashing existing widely held values of responsibility to affect new social norms for sustainability, especially by extending notions of responsibility to include impacts associated with consumption. 4. Addressing inequalities, especially regarding income and gender, which undermine capacity for sustainability. 5. Ensuring inclusive decision-making, fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use and adherence to human rights in conservation decisions. 6. Accounting for nature deteriorations from local economic activities and socio-economic environmental interactions over distances, telecouplings, including, for instance, international trade. 7. Ensuring environmentally friendly technological and social innovation, taking into account potential rebound effects and investment regimes. And 8. promoting education, knowledge generation and maintenance of different knowledge systems, including the sciences and indigenous and local knowledge regarding nature, conservation and its sustainable use. Key message D4. The character and trajectories of transformation will vary across contexts, with challenges and needs differing, among others, in developing and developed countries. Risks related to inevitable uncertainties and complexities in transformations towards sustainability can be reduced through governance approaches that are integrative, inclusive, informed and adaptive. Such approaches typically take into account the synergies and trade-offs between societal goals and alternative pathways and recognise a plurality of values, diverse economic conditions, inequity, power imbalances and vested interests in society. Risk-reducing strategies typically include learning from experience that is based on a combination of precautionary measures and existing and emerging knowledge. These approaches involve stakeholders in the coordination of policies across sectors and the creation of strategic, locally relevant mixes of successful policy instruments. The private sector can play roles in partnership with other actors, including national and subnational governments and civil society. For example, public-private partnerships in the water sector have been an important vehicle for financing investments to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Some effective policy measures include the expansion and strengthening of ecologically represented and well-connected protected area networks, and other effective area-based conservation measures, the protection of watersheds, and incentives and sanctions to reduce pollution. Key message D5. Recognising the knowledge, innovations and practices, institutions and values of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and their inclusion and participation in environmental governance often enhances their quality of life, as well as nature conservation, restoration and sustainable use, which is relevant to broader society. Governance, including customary institutions and management systems, and co-management regimes involving Indigenous peoples and local communities can be an effective way to safeguard nature and its contributions to people, incorporating locally attuned management systems and Indigenous and local knowledge. The positive contributions of Indigenous peoples and local communities to sustainability can be facilitated through national recognition of land tenure, access and resource rights in accordance with national legislation, the application of free, prior and informed consent, and improved collaboration, fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use and co-management arrangements with local communities. Key message D6. Feeding humanity and enhancing the conservation and sustainable use of nature are complementary and closely interdependent goals that can be advanced through sustainable agricultural, aquacultural and livestock systems, the safeguarding of native species, varieties, breeds and habitats, and ecological restoration. Specific actions include promoting sustainable agricultural practices, such as good agricultural and agroecological practices, among others, multifunctional landscape planning and cross-sectoral integrated management that support the conservation of genetic diversity and associated agricultural biodiversity. Further actions to simultaneously achieve food security, biodiversity protection and sustainable use are context-appropriate climate change mitigation and adaptation, incorporating knowledge from various systems, including the sciences and sustainable Indigenous and local practices, avoiding food waste, empowering producers and consumers to transform supply chains, and facilitating sustainable and healthy dietary choices. As part of integrated landscape planning and management, prompt ecological restoration, emphasising the use of native species, can offset current degradation and save many endangered species, but is less effective if delayed. Key message D7. Sustaining and conserving fisheries and marine species and ecosystems can be achieved through a coordinated mix of interventions on land, in freshwater and in the oceans, including multi-level coordination across stakeholders on the use of open oceans. Specific actions could include, for example, ecosystem-based approaches to fisheries management, spatial planning, effective quotas, marine protected areas, protecting and managing key marine biodiversity areas, reducing runoff pollutions into oceans, and working closely with producers and consumers. It is important to enhance capacity building for the adoption of best fisheries management practices, adopt measures to promote conservation financing and corporate social responsibility, develop new legal and binding instruments, implement and enforce global agreements for responsible fisheries, and urgently take all steps necessary to prevent, deter and eliminate illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. Key message D8. Land-based climate mitigation activities can be effective and support conservation goals. However, the large-scale deployment of bioenergy plantations and afforestation of non-forest ecosystems can come with negative side effects for biodiversity and ecosystem functions. Nature-based solutions with safeguards are estimated to provide 37% of climate change mitigation until 2030 needed to meet 2 degrees Celsius goals, with likely co-benefits for biodiversity. Therefore, land use actions are indispensable, in addition to strong actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel use and other industrial and agricultural activities. However, the large-scale deployment of intensive bioenergy plantations, including monocultures, replacing natural forests and subsistence farmlands, will likely have negative impacts on biodiversity and can threaten food and water security, as well as local livelihoods, including by intensifying social conflict. Key message D9. Nature-based solutions can be cost-effective for meeting the Sustainable Development Goals in cities, which are crucial for global sustainability. Increased use of green infrastructure and other ecosystem-based approaches can help to advance sustainable urban development while reinforcing climate mitigation and adaptation. Urban key biodiversity areas should be safeguarded. Solutions can include retrofitting green and blue infrastructure, such as creating and maintaining green spaces and biodiversity-friendly water bodies, urban agriculture, rooftop gardens, and expanded and accessible vegetation cover in existing urban and peri-urban areas and new developments. Green infrastructure in urban and their surrounding rural areas can complement large-scale grey infrastructure in areas such as flood protection, temperature regulation, cleaning of air and water, treating wastewater, and the provision of energy, locally sourced food, and the health benefits of interaction with nature. Key message D10. A key constituent of sustainable pathways is the evolution of global financial and economic systems to build a global sustainable economy, steering away from the current limited paradigm of economic growth. That implies incorporating the reduction of inequalities into development pathways, reducing overconsumption and waste, and addressing environmental impacts such as externalities of economic activities from the local to the global scales. Such an evolution can be enabled through a mix of policies and tools, such as incentive programs, certification and performance standards, and more internationally consistent taxation, supported by multilateral agreements and enhanced environmental monitoring and evaluation. It would also entail a shift beyond standard economic indicators such as gross domestic product to include those able to capture more holistic, long-term views of economics and quality of life.